Go back to the decision to offer Austrian neutrality to the Soviet Union, all of these issues came up for discussion. And remember that this is in 1955, just 10 years after the end of the Second World War. And the Russians were still at that point understandably sensitive to the possibility that Germany, Austria, and the German-speaking world in general might recover and pose another threat to the Soviet Union. The outcome was, of course, that you got the Austrian State Treaty arrangement. And the Austrian State Treaty included very definite limitations on Austrian military power and excluded any foreign forces from entry into Austria or any permanent presence of any kind on Austrian soil. This worked out very, very well. In fact, at the time, President Eisenhower said, well, this is wonderful because we simply don't have the military resources, the manpower, the capabilities to defend numerous countries all across Europe against the potential offensive operations of the Soviet military. So let's get Austria, quote unquote, off the board. Let's just take them off, make them neutral. Then subsequently, he said, we should look at a way to neutralize the rest of Eastern Europe if it can be done as the best means of securing peace. Now, that was in 1955 after the largest and most destructive war in human history. Here we sit in 2025 listening to people who consider themselves to be bright and smart and knowledgeable tell us the exact opposite, that if Ukraine is not allowed in any way to maintain whatever military power it wants, that then it will never be safe from Russia, instead of understanding that that's exactly how we got into the war to begin with. We went in there, we invested billions of dollars, we built the most modern, well-equipped, well-trained army in NATO. And what's the result? Well, Russia was very threatened, and understandably so, because almost immediately after the coup in 2014, what did the Ukrainians start to do? They started shelling Luhansk and Donetsk. Though the war got started almost immediately after we installed our puppets in Kiev. These people on the Hill are out of touch with reality. They do not understand the issues at stake. They think we are stronger and more powerful than we are, and they grossly overestimate European capacities. So it's just a statement of the absurd. It bears no influence on reality whatsoever.
What he's pointing out is simple, but completely ignored today. Neutrality worked. It kept Austria safe, it kept Europe stable, and it prevented a bigger war. But instead of learning from that success, Washington flipped the logic upside down. We armed Ukraine to the teeth, pushed NATO right to Russia's doorstep, and acted shocked when Moscow felt threatened. It's a disconnect from reality, and it's the same mistake that triggered this entire conflict.
You don't talk to the people in charge in Russia to begin with, and at least established the foundations for some commonality of interest and agreement. What do you expect to happen? Well, I think you expect nothing to happen. I think Witkoff was talking to somebody that had worked with Goldman Sachs and BlackRock. Man lives primarily in Palo Alto. He doesn't represent anyone in Moscow. As far as I can tell, he doesn't represent anybody in Kiev. So what do we get? We get this nothing burger, if you will, of 28 specious points that are irrelevant, that are not even open for discussion. That's the first part. Secondly, from the very beginning, I have wondered why President Trump pays as much attention to the Europeans and NATO as he does. Why? Because the European states in NATO are analogous in many ways to the Greek city-states at the time of the Roman Empire. Initially, the Greek city-states found this Philip of Macedonia, who was a descendant of Alexander the Great, and his father Philip, reprehensible. They couldn't get rid of them. They were an oppressive, tyrannical group. And so they invited the Romans to come into Greece to help rid themselves of the Macedonian menace, which they did. The Romans threw them out, defeated the Macedonians, liberated Greece. And everything was fine until the Greek city-states decided to fight with each other. The Romans intervened again and said, look, we didn't liberate you so that you could kill each other and disrupt trade and commercial development in the Eastern Mediterranean. So we're taking over. We're running the place, which is effectively what we did after World War II. We said we're not going to allow anybody in Europe to fight anymore. We're going to establish peace. These are the guidelines. The Greek city-states became irrelevant because they were just other members of the greater Roman Empire. Well, this is going to sound harsh, but that's true for Europe and the United States today. And the Europeans have gone to great lengths to make themselves permanently dependent upon us for their survival, not just militarily, but I would argue also economically. Now, that may change as a result of the recent events, but why should President Trump pay any attention to the NATO allies? He should get them into a room and say, this is it. No more war. We've had it. We're going to end it. These are the terms to which we are prepared to agree. If you don't like it, well, there are things we can do because you are dependent upon us. We can make life very miserable for you. That's what Eisenhower did in the aftermath of the Suez Crisis. He made it clear to the British and the French and others, if you don't get the hell out of Egypt and let this thing alone, then we are going to take measures against you, which are going to pull the rug out from under you financially. I guess my point is that for all the bluster, all the big talk that comes out of Trump, he behaves like a pussycat. Oh, won't you please sign on for this? We'd like your input. We want you to join us. The hell with that. We have no interest in this war in Ukraine. We never have. We have no interest in Ukraine other than stability and peace. That's what should have been stated right up front. Instead, we were dragged into this ridiculous anti-Russian crusade, largely because of the people that were running the Biden administration, and many of the people running this administration are no different. They adhere to the same principles, the same thinking. You know, it's not just Israel über alles. It's we're going to demand that Russia commit suicide before we do business with them. It's insane. It's all got to change. But he doesn't seem to be a free agent. He doesn't seem to be able to act decisively on his own in the interests of the American people.
A breakdown of why current US and NATO diplomacy is failing, why Europe remains dependent on Washington, and how ignoring real decision makers has led to a dead-end strategy in Ukraine. Colonel Douglas Macgregor exposes the core mistakes driving this conflict.
Merkel, as Chancellor of Germany, and I'm by no means a fan of Angela Merkel. She did more to destroy Germany by opening its borders in 2015 than I think anybody since Adolf Hitler took Germany to war against the Soviet Union. But Angela Merkel did grow up in East Germany for the most part. She did learn something about the Russians. And she said on more than one occasion while she was chancellor that we need to understand that President Putin cannot conceive of any circumstances under which he cannot win a war in Ukraine. And she was right. If there's a war Russia knows it can win, not just Vladimir Putin, but everyone, it's a war on Russia's doorstep. It's a war in eastern Ukraine or even in western Ukraine, because you're talking about a force that can be built up and then ultimately commutes to the fight. Who cannot win in Ukraine? We can't. We're too far away. We can't mass the forces. We can't build up to do anything. And the Europeans, they lack both the resolve, the will, and the understanding to field a force that could defeat the Russians. So it's all nonsense. Anything that Jack Keane says about the war in Ukraine is nonsense. Forget it. It's a dead end. We can't win it. Now, I think privately there have been moments of lucidity when Donald Trump has effectively said that, when he said in the Oval Office to Zelensky, you don't have any cards to play. What he didn't know is that his donors were on Zelensky's team, and his donors were going to tell him, you have to stick with this, Donald, because his donors, these are the ones driving us to war with Iran, driving us to war with anybody Israel doesn't like, also hate Russia. Okay, it's not an American interest. But whose payroll are all of these people on? That's the question you have to ask. I wish every time Fox or CNN or somebody brings up an individual and puts the name up there, they should put beneath it sources of income. What are the sources of income? Well, it's probably Raytheon, Lockheed Martin, APAC, or some derivative of APAC. I mean, come on, let's be honest. Who is funding these talking heads? If Americans understood that, they would step back in horror. and suddenly realize that none of these people are saying or doing anything that is in the interest of the United States. And frankly, this has been the problem from the very beginning. I saw this back in the 90s. The view was, it doesn't matter. We can sell our country down the road because it doesn't hurt us. We're great. We're powerful. No one can ever touch us. Nothing can ever harm us. So what difference does it make? What difference does it make if another few million illegals come into the country? What difference does it make if we embroil ourselves in conflicts in Africa, Asia, or Latin America, or Eastern Europe? Because we're great. We're powerful. Nobody can challenge us. Nobody can touch us. Well, that's wrong. It's dead wrong. And we are more vulnerable today than ever in our history. We have created a situation of extreme danger to the United States, not just militarily, but financially and economically. You know, someone was talking to me earlier today and said, you know, the problem, Doug, and this is someone overseas who's very heavily engaged in the banking industry. He said, you know, when people look at us and at the United States, and then they look at China, they conclude very quickly that China's economy, which has doubled, tripled in size since 2005, given its population, given the successful implementation of state-sponsored capitalism in China, even though China has a great deal of debt, just as we do, everyone is confident that the Chinese economy is going to outgrow its debt. No one believes, based upon what they're seeing inside the United States today, that the United States has any chance whatsoever of growing out of its debt. Absolutely not. And so the world is moving away from us into this thing called BRICS. And that puts everything at risk. So my point is that the people talking in these terms are not only dangerously wrong, they're putting the country in severe jeopardy. Because what we need now more than ever before in our history is peace and stability. The stability that comes from peace that is the foundation for prosperity. We need to dump all of this overseas and look very carefully at what we need to do here at home to rebuild our economy, rebuild this financial system to make sense, to end the financialization of our economy, to start producing and building things, which we have not done for decades.
He's cutting through the noise here. Russia sees Ukraine as a must-win, and the West simply doesn't have the proximity, manpower, or political will to match that. Merkel understood this, but today's analysts pretend distance doesn't matter, and the bigger point is uncomfortable. Many of the loudest voices pushing this war aren't driven by national interest, but by donors and defense industry money. Once you realize that, the entire narrative looks very different and far more dangerous for America's future.
These are all lies. And the lies are the foundation for the failed policies that he and his colleagues in Europe have pursued. If he admits that the Russian losses are minuscule compared with the enormous losses of the Ukrainians, well, that undermines his argument. It would be the humane thing for him to do because he's just flat out lying. None of that is true. It reminds me of the commitments that were made by Franklin Roosevelt and Churchill that said Poland will be a free, independent, democratic state at the end of this war. Well, you know what happened? No such thing. It's almost as ridiculous as Gerald Ford, who during his bid for election, when he ran for president after having succeeded Nixon, said that Poland will never be a Soviet satellite under a Ford administration. And of course, it had been a Soviet satellite since the end of the Second World War. Politicians lie all the time. They lie when it's impossible to do anything else because the truth is too dangerous. The truth is too destructive. Starmer is in a lot of trouble. He is the most universally hated person in the British Isles. He's not going to last. And frankly, Britain is in very serious financial as well as political trouble. If it all comes together, we could see something on the scale of the English Civil Wars. I commend everybody to listen to David Betts, who's studied the potential for revolutionary change in Great Britain now for many years, and his more recent works give great detail in support of what I've just said. So I wouldn't pay too much attention to Starmer. Macron won't be far behind, and neither will be Merz in Berlin. These people are all on the road to extinction.
He's cutting through the noise here. Russia sees Ukraine as a must-win, and the West simply doesn't have the proximity, manpower, or political will to match that. Merkel understood this, but today's analysts pretend distance doesn't matter, and the bigger point is uncomfortable. Many of the loudest voices pushing this war aren't driven by national interest, but by donors and defense industry money. Once you realize that, the entire narrative looks very different and far more dangerous for America's future.
Already seen a lot of evidence that the pace of operations has picked up. We now know that Russian forces have between themselves and the Dnieper River essentially open rolling terrain. The ball is truly in Russia's court. Moscow has to decide what it wants to do. The longer the stupidity drags on in Western Europe, the more threats that are made against Russia, the more likely it is that the Russians conclude that the only safety they can aspire to is the complete taking of territory up to the Dnieper River, because they'll see the Dnieper River as a natural barrier, a natural defensive line. That's what they'll do. And I still say that whatever happens, they will end up with both Odessa and Kharkov that are historically Russian cities, not Ukrainian. And when those cities are in their hands, they may be willing to talk about alternatives to the status quo, but not much until they get there. So I think the Russians now have the ability to end this by the end of the year on terms that they find acceptable. They would prefer what I discussed earlier, for these governments in London and Paris and Berlin to change. And they may. There's a real potential for that. But in the meantime, they're just going to have to press ahead, and they can expect nothing from us. And by the way, the interesting part is, President Trump has largely walked away from this business. I mean, he's willing to say, here's a 28-point plan, go look at it. But he's not really interested in it. Why is he not really interested? Because he can't be at the center of it. Remember, President Trump's all about optics. If this does not create the illusion that he wants, that somehow or another he's settled his, whatever it is, 19th war, whatever count he's aspiring to. Yeah. If he can't say that, then he's not really interested anyway. So I think he'll play it off, which is what he's effectively done with these promises of more military assistance to Ukraine. Most of that material will not arrive for a year, 2 years, or longer. By the time that happens, there won't be a Ukraine unless somebody wakes up quickly and recognizes that they need a new government in Kiev, and the one that's there is a permanent obstacle to peace. Who knows? Everything is possible. It's not impossible. Something like that could happen. But right now, the Russians have to assume no change in the near term, which means they march west.
He's laying out the reality nobody in the West wants to say out loud. Russia now has the momentum, the terrain, and the strategic position to decide how this war ends. And unless Europe's governments change course, Moscow will simply keep advancing until it reaches a defensible line. Trump's disengagement only underscores the point. Washington isn't invested, Europe is paralyzed, and Kyiv is stuck with a government that's blocking any path to peace. In that situation, Russia holds all the cards.
Look at the enormous buildup of American military power, whether it is offshore in the Caribbean or the buildup of forces on Puerto Rico that ostensibly will be eventually transported south into Venezuela. It strikes me as very, very unlikely that the President of the United States will suddenly announce after Thanksgiving, I've changed my mind. We've come into an agreement with Venezuela. We're not going in. I just don't see that happening. I think at some point you cross the proverbial Rubicon. The buildup of U.S. military power is enormous, and I think the temptation to use it is overwhelming. And remember that at least in the latest polls that I've seen, roughly 70% of Americans polled have expressed opposition to the idea of going into Venezuela with military power. They don't want another war, and they don't want a war in the Caribbean. They don't want a war with Venezuela. Doesn't make any difference. And I think there's an assumption, a set of assumptions, I haven't seen them all, that suggests that this will be quick, decisive, and successful. And the attitude is if it's quick, decisive, and successful, no one will complain. And if we have casualties, there'll be very few. That's one assumption. The second assumption is if it's not quick, decisive, and immediately successful, well, we'll get the rally round the flag effect. Americans will say, well, we have to support the president, we have to support our troops, and so forth. I think both assumptions are false. I don't think it's going to be quick, decisive, and easy. And I don't know the details of how we're going to install Mrs. Machado and replace Maduro. I have no idea. I do know the difficulties of the terrain, the difficulties of going into Caracas from the coast, the numerous places where air and missile defense forces can be placed, but that have been generously made available by the Russians. We also know that many of the strike missiles that the Russians have arrived in Venezuela, could be used against offshore vessels, ships, and so forth. It may be that our intelligence is telling the president that we can identify everything wherever it is. We can, preempt by striking all of these locations. I don't know. I mean, you'd have to sit in there and listen to these briefings, but you always have to examine for any operation the assumptions.
He's warning that once you build up that much military power, the pressure to use it becomes overwhelming, even when most Americans want nothing to do with another war. And the assumptions behind a Venezuela invasion aren't grounded in reality. The terrain, the defenses, and the risks make this far from the quick and easy operation Washington imagines.